3 days before her wedding, Delia Winslow stood in her father's kitchen in Elkhorn, Wyoming territory, holding a letter addressed to a man she had never met. It had come in the regular mail delivery, tucked in with a seed catalog and a note from her aunt about wedding flowers, a plain envelope postmarked from Missouri, addressed in a careful, tired hand to Mr. Ezra Whitcomb, care of the Winslow Ranch, Elkhorn, Wyoming territory. There was no Ezra Whitcomb at the Winslow Ranch. There was only Caleb Rourke, the quiet horse trainer her father had hired a year and a half before, the man Delia was set to marry on Saturday, and the man who had walked out to check the north pasture fence that very morning, with no idea that the mail had brought his bride-to-be, a name he had never once spoken to her. Delia turned the envelope over twice, told herself firmly that it was almost certainly a mistake, a misdirected letter meant for some other ranch entirely, and then noticed, in the corner where a return address should have been, 4 words that made her mistake theory considerably harder to believe. From your sister, Mary. She did not open it that first hour. She sat at the kitchen table with it in front of her, and she thought about the year and a half she had spent falling in love with a man who flinched, very slightly, every time a stranger rode up the lane unannounced, who had never once mentioned a family, a hometown, or a life before Elkhorn, and who had asked her, more than once, half joking and half not, whether she thought a person could be forgiven for things nobody else ever found out about. I have read the letter that finally sat inside that envelope more times than I can easily count, because Delia Winslow kept every one of them for the rest of her life, and her granddaughter was kind enough, many years later, to let a stranger like me copy them out in full. What was inside changed the shape of Delia's wedding considerably less than you might expect, and changed her understanding of the man she was marrying considerably more than either of them could have guessed sitting at that kitchen table. She opened it at noon, alone, before her father came in for dinner. It was not the only letter Mary Whitcomb had ever written her brother. It was, as Delia would soon discover, going through a bundle of 6 years' worth of correspondence that had never once reached the man they were addressed to, only the latest. Mary's newest letter was 4 pages, but it was the small, worn bundle tied with string underneath it. 6 older letters Mary had enclosed, for reasons that would only become clear later, that told Delia the story from its beginning. The oldest letter was dated 6 years back, from a town in Missouri Delia had never heard of, and it began plainly enough that she nearly convinced herself again it belonged to some other family entirely. Dear Ezra, wherever you have gotten to, I do not know if this will ever find you, and I am sending it to the last address anyone in this county remembers you mentioning, a stage stop in Kansas that is probably long since closed. I want you to know, first thing, before anything else, I never believed it, not for one single hour. Whatever they are saying about you and Mr. Colby's death, your own sister knows it is a lie, and I intend to spend however long it takes proving it, because you are the only family I have left worth the trouble. Delia sat with that first page a long time before turning to the second. Ezra Whitcomb, the letters explained in careful pieces, had been 22 years old and working as a bookkeeper for a small mining concern outside a Missouri town called Barrow's Fork, run jointly by his own father and a business partner named Harmon Colby. When Harmon Colby was found shot dead in the mine office one evening, the only person known to have argued bitterly with him that same afternoon over books that did not balance the way Colby insisted they should was Ezra. There had been no trial worth calling one. A frightened county, a grieving town, and a sheriff up for re-election had moved fast, and Ezra, seeing the noose in every face at his own arraignment, had done the one thing that ensured he would carry the accusation the rest of his life even if it saved that life in the short term. He had escaped custody the night before his hearing, with help from a jailer who owed his father a debt, and had run west and never once looked back, changing his name 3 times before Caleb Rourke finally stuck. He did not do it, Mary had written, in that first letter, and in every one after it. Harmon Colby's own ledgers do not balance the way Ezra was accused of hiding, and I have begun to believe, the longer I look at them, that they do not balance because somebody else entirely was skimming from that mine and needed a bookkeeper dead or gone before he asked the wrong question out loud. To understand how much the letters cost her to read, you should understand first how Caleb Rourke had actually shown up in Delia Winslow's life, because the man in Mary's letters and the man Delia had spent 1.5 years falling in love with did not, at first glance, seem entirely like the same person. He had ridden into Elkhorn 18 months before, with 2 horses, a bedroll, and a reputation that arrived a full week ahead of him, word from a rancher 2 counties over that a quiet drifter named Rourke could gentle a wild horse faster and kinder than any man in the territory. Franklin Winslow, Delia's father, had a barn full of half-broke stock and no patience left for breaking it himself, and he'd hired Caleb on the spot after watching him work a single skittish gelding for 20 minutes. What Franklin Winslow got, and what Delia got alongside him, was a hired hand who worked harder and asked for less than any man they had ever employed, who mended things nobody had asked him to mend, who read every book in the Winslow house twice over a long winter and never once mentioned where he'd learned to read so well, and who watched every rider coming up the lane with a particular careful stillness that Delia had, for 1.5 years, mistaken for simple frontier caution. She fell in love with him slowly, the way you fall in love with someone you see doing small, honest things every day, rather than someone who says large, romantic things once. He had noticed, without being told, that her father's hip pained him worse in cold weather, and had quietly taken over the heaviest morning chores without ever making a show of it. He had sat up 2 full nights the winter before, nursing a sick foal that everyone else had given up on, and cried, actually cried, when it finally stood on its own legs, which was the moment Delia had privately decided, watching him from the barn door, that she intended to marry this man if he would have her. He had asked her, that same spring, in the plainest possible words, sitting on the corral fence, with the sunset going orange behind the mountains. I've got things behind me I'm not proud of, Delia. Nothing I did on purpose to hurt anybody, but things that would make plenty of decent people look at me different if they knew the whole of it. I need you to know that's true before you say yes to anything, because I won't have you promising yourself to a man you don't at least know that much about. Do you intend to tell me the whole of it? She had asked. One day, he'd said, when I trust the ground under both our feet enough that the telling won't wash it out from under us. He had looked at her very seriously. I am asking you to marry a man with a shadow behind him I haven't shown you yet, Delia Winslow. That's not a fair thing to ask. I'm asking it anyway, because I don't believe I get another chance at a woman like you, and I'd rather ask unfairly than not ask at all. She had said yes anyway, that spring, trusting the 2 years of small, honest evidence over the one large, unnamed shadow, and now, 3 days before the wedding, his own past had apparently decided to arrive by mail instead of by his own mouth. Delia found herself grateful, in a strange, complicated way, that she already had 1.5 years of proof about the kind of man he actually was, waiting underneath whatever the letters were about to tell her. The second and third letters, dated roughly 2 and 3 years after the first, showed Delia a woman growing steadily more determined rather than more discouraged, and they filled in a piece of the story that made Delia's hands go cold reading it. Mary had spent those 2 years doing what the county sheriff never had, actually investigating Harmon Colby's murder, rather than simply accepting the fastest available answer. She had gone through her late father's old business papers, quietly, after he passed, and found correspondence between Harmon Colby and a man named Barnaby Fitch, a silent investor in the Barrows Fork mine whose name had never once come up during the hurried inquiry into Colby's death. Fitch had put considerable money into that mine, and considerably more debt than anyone knew, Mary had written in the second letter. I have found records showing Colby wrote to him twice in the month before his death, demanding an accounting of ore shipments that Fitch's own numbers did not match. I believe Colby was murdered because he was about to discover Fitch had been secretly diverting ore for 2 years, and I believe our own father's bookkeeper, our own Ezra, was the most convenient man in the county to blame for it, being young, being new to the position, and having argued with Colby, entirely about something else. On the very afternoon, somebody else entirely decided to silence him. The third letter, a year later still, contained the detail that had apparently taken Mary the longest to run down and cost her the most to obtain. A former mine hand, dying and wanting to settle his conscience, had confessed to Mary's own minister that he had seen Barnaby Fitch himself leaving the mine office the evening of Colby's death. Well after the hour, Ezra had already gone home for supper, a detail the original hurried inquiry had never once bothered to check against anybody's actual account of the evening. I have his confession in writing, witnessed by our minister, Mary wrote. It is not, my brother, proof enough by itself to hang Fitch in a courtroom, but it is proof enough that you never should have run in the first place, and proof enough that I intend to keep pulling this thread until the whole of it comes free, however many years it costs either of us. Delia set the third letter down and sat very still at the kitchen table, understanding for the first time the actual size of what her husband-to-be had been carrying alone for 6 years, a wrongful accusation, a sister's lonely 6-year campaign to clear it, and a fear so large it had cost him 3 names and an entire life he might otherwise have lived openly. Delia told her father that same night because a wedding in 2 days left no honest room to wait, and because Franklin Winslow had trusted Caleb Rourke with his ranch, his stock, and eventually his daughter, and deserved better than to learn the truth secondhand at his own child's wedding. He listened to the whole of it without interrupting, at the kitchen table, the same table the letters had first spread across that afternoon, and when Delia finished, he sat quiet long enough that she began to fear the answer before he gave it. I hired that boy off nothing but a reputation for gentling horses, Franklin said finally, and inside a month, I'd have trusted him with considerably more than my stock. A man doesn't nurse a dying foal through 2 sleepless nights, or take over an old man's heaviest chores without once being asked or thanked for it, because he's practicing to deceive somebody. He does it because it's who he is, clean through. He looked at his daughter steadily. I've buried a wife and near buried a hip, Delia. And the one thing 30 years of ranching has taught me plainer than anything else is that you can tell more about a man from how he treats a suffering animal than from any name on any wanted paper. I don't care what they called him in Missouri 6 years ago. I care what he's called himself, in his actions, every single day since he rode up this lane. You're not angry he hid it. I'm not overjoyed he hid it, Franklin said. A father likes to know the whole of the man marrying his daughter. But I understand considerably better than most exactly how much a person can be forgiven for what fear makes them do, having done a fair share of hiding myself after your mother passed, and I'll not stand in judgment of a man for the same failing I've been guilty of in my own smaller way. He reached across and patted her hand, the closest thing to open sentiment Franklin Winslow generally allowed himself. Marry him Saturday, girl. same as planned. Whatever his sister brings on that Friday stage, it isn't going to change one thing about the man who's already spent 1.5 years proving himself to this family in every way that actually matters. What Delia did not fully explain to her father, because she had not entirely worked it out herself until she lay awake that night turning it over, was that some part of her had already decided to marry Ezra Whitcomb before she had any idea whether Mary's evidence would actually clear his name in time, or at all. She lay in her own bed that Thursday night, with 6 years of letters read and reread, until she had whole passages by memory, and she asked herself honestly the question she suspected any sensible woman ought to ask in her position. If Mary's stage arrived Friday without enough proof, if Barnaby Fitch's guilt remained forever a strong suspicion rather than a settled fact, if Ezra Whitcomb went to his own grave, technically still a fugitive from a charge nobody had ever properly disproven in a courtroom, would she still walk out under those cottonwoods on Saturday and marry him anyway? She found the answer came easier than she expected, and came without much argument from the more cautious parts of herself that she had half expected to put up a fight. Yes, she would marry him anyway. Not because she had blind faith that required no evidence at all. She was not a foolish woman, and she did not think herself one, but because the evidence she actually needed had never been sitting in Mary Whitcomb's leather case in the first place. It had been sitting in a barn on a cold night 18 months ago, in a man who cried over a foal nobody else believed would live. It had been sitting in 1,000 small chores, done without being asked. 1,000 books read quietly by a man teaching himself the things his interrupted life had denied him. 1,000 mornings of a hired hand, who worked like the ranch was already his own, before anyone had given him a single reason to feel that way about it. Mary's letters, when they finally reached her, had not taught Delia Winslow whether to trust Ezra Whitcomb. They had only, at last, explained why the man she already trusted completely had spent so long looking like he expected the ground to open beneath him. The legal proof mattered enormously, for his freedom, for his sister's 6 years of exhausting work, for a murdered man's overdue justice. It had never, in the end, been the proof Delia herself required to know her own heart, and she fell asleep that Thursday night, considerably more settled than she had any reasonable right to be, 3 days before a wedding that had briefly threatened to come apart at the seams, and had instead, if anything, been welded stronger by the strain. Shakespeare wrote, centuries before any of them were born, that a rose by any other name would smell exactly as sweet, and Delia found herself thinking of that line more than once that Thursday night, turning it over until it fit the shape of her own situation better than it had ever fit a garden. A name, she decided, drifting finally toward sleep, was only ever the label somebody else needed in order to file a man away as guilty or innocent, safe or dangerous, a stranger or a husband. It had never once been the thing that made Ezra Whitcomb worth loving. That part of him had been true under every name he had ever carried, Rourke included, and would go on being true under whatever name the morning finally settled on for good. The 4th and 5th letters, written across the following 2 years, showed Mary Whitcomb's investigation slowing to a discouraging crawl, Barnaby Fitch having grown considerably more careful once he apparently caught wind that someone was still asking questions about the mine's old ledgers. But the 6th letter, dated only 4 months before this last one, changed everything, and Delia understood, reading it, why Mary had finally enclosed all 6 together, instead of continuing to send them one at a time, into a silence she had no way of knowing whether anyone ever received. I have found him, Mary had written. Not Ezra. I still do not know where you have gotten to after 6 years, and I write these letters now more for my own conscience than any real hope of an answer. I mean, I have found the man who can finish this, A clerk who worked under Fitch at a second mining concern in Colorado, dismissed 2 years ago for reasons that turn out to have everything to do with Fitch's book cooking and nothing to do with the drunkenness Fitch blamed him for, has agreed to testify to a pattern of exactly the kind of diverted ore accounting that killed Harmon Colby. Combined with the dying hand's confession our minister witnessed years ago and Colby's own letters demanding an accounting, I believe for the first time in 6 years that I can actually clear your name in a courtroom rather than simply believe it in my own heart. The letter that had arrived this week, the newest one, the one addressed plainly to Ezra Whitcomb at the Winslow Ranch, explained how Mary had finally tracked him there at all. A Pinkerton agent, hired at considerable expense, with money Mary had saved for 6 years specifically for this purpose, had traced a man matching Ezra's old description, name changed twice, to a ranch in Elkhorn, Wyoming, working as a horse trainer under the name Caleb Rourke. "I am coming myself," the final letter said. "I will arrive by the stage on Friday with the clerk's sworn statement, the dying man's witnessed confession, and a lawyer I have retained in Cheyenne who believes, as I do, that 6 years is long enough for an innocent man to live afraid. I do not know what I will find when I arrive, brother. Whether you are still the boy who once cried over our mother's grave, or a man I will hardly recognize after everything you have survived alone. I know only that I am done writing letters into silence, and I am coming to finish this in person, whatever it costs either of us." Friday, Delia realized, staring at the date on the letter, was the day before her wedding. He came in from the north pasture at dusk, tired and easy in the particular way of a man who has spent a good day doing honest work, and he found Delia sitting at the kitchen table, with 6 years of letters spread out in front of her, and an expression on her face he had clearly spent 1.5 years hoping never to see. He did not ask what she was holding. He looked at the letters, looked at her face, and sat down slowly across the table, as if his legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold him up standing. "You know," he said, "it was not a question." "I know your name is Ezra Whitcomb," Delia said quietly. "I know you didn't kill anybody, and I know your sister has spent 6 years proving it, while you were 3 states away, carrying a fear you never let me see, except in flashes I mistook for shyness. I know she's arriving on the stage tomorrow, the day before our wedding, with a lawyer and enough evidence to clear your name in front of an actual court." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "What I want to know, Ezra, is why you never told me yourself, in 1.5 years, even the part that wasn't dangerous. Even just your real name." He was quiet a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had none of its usual careful evenness left in it at all. "Because every time I opened my mouth to say it, I heard the sound of a noose being fitted in my own head," he said. "I was 22 years old, Delia, and I watched an entire town decide I was guilty before anybody asked me a single honest question, and I have spent 6 years since believing, somewhere underneath all my better sense, that the same thing would happen again the moment anybody learned my real name, you included. I told myself I was protecting you. Some of that was true. Most of it, if I am honest with you the way I should have been from the start, was that I was protecting the only thing I had left, which was your believing I was a good man, and I was afraid that knowing the whole truth might cost me that belief, before I ever got the chance to prove it was still true, underneath the name. You've spent 1.5 years proving it was true, Delia said. Every single day, Ezra. I didn't need your real name to know what kind of man you are. I needed it to understand what kind of frightened boy you used to be. And frankly, having read what your sister went through to save him, I find I love that frightened boy considerably more than I already loved the careful man he turned into hiding from him. Mary Whitcomb stepped off the Friday stage into Elkhorn, a thin, tired, formidably determined woman of perhaps 30, with a leather case of documents held against her chest, like something she had carried too far to risk dropping now, and the lawyer from Cheyenne, a dry, precise man named Thaddeus Poole, one step behind her, looking considerably less prepared for the emotional weight of the reunion than for the legal one. She saw her brother waiting on the platform and dropped the leather case entirely, running the last 20 feet the way you run towards something you have spent 6 years afraid you would never see again. And Ezra caught her, and neither of them said anything coherent for a full minute, and Delia, watching from a respectful distance with her father beside her, understood that she was witnessing the actual ending of the story the letters had only been able to describe from far away. "You look older," Mary said finally, stepping back to look at him properly, laughing and crying in the same breath. "You look older, and considerably more sunburned, and I would know your face anywhere on this earth, Ezra Whitcomb, whatever name you've been hiding it under. You look like you've spent 6 years fighting a war nobody else believed needed fighting," Ezra said, "which I understand now is exactly what you did." Thaddeus Poole, recovering his professional composure, laid out for Franklin Winslow and the county's own circuit judge, hastily summoned once word of the matter reached him, exactly what evidence Mary Whitcomb had assembled. The dying hands witnessed confession, placing Barnaby Fitch at the mine office at the hour of the murder. The dismissed clerk's sworn statement, detailing years of diverted ore accounting. Colby's own letters demanding an accounting from Fitch in the weeks before his death, letters Mary had saved from her father's old papers. It was not, Poole admitted honestly, an airtight conviction of Fitch delivered on the spot, 6 years and 1 territory away from where the crime occurred. It was, the circuit judge agreed after 2 hours of careful review, more than sufficient grounds to formally clear Ezra Whitcomb of any remaining charge, refer the new evidence to the Missouri authorities for Fitch's actual prosecution, and put an end, once and for all, to 6 years of a man living under a fear that had never been legally justified in the first place. They married the next day as planned, on Saturday, under the cottonwoods behind the Winslow ranch house, and if the guest list had grown by exactly 2 people since Thursday, a formidable aunt-like sister and a dry Cheyenne lawyer who turned out, after 2 glasses of wedding punch, to dance considerably better than anyone expected, nobody in Elkhorn thought it anything but a fine addition to the day. Ezra Whitcomb married Delia Winslow under his own true name for the first time in 6 years, and the circuit judge himself, moved enough by the whole affair to stay an extra day for the ceremony, remarked afterward that he had presided over a great many legal matters in his career, and very few that had ended with quite this much genuine joy attached to the paperwork. Mary Whitcomb stood up for her brother, in place of the family he no longer entirely had, and cried through the whole ceremony without one bit of shame about it, and told Delia afterward, holding both her hands, that she had spent 6 years writing letters to a silence that never answered, and that watching her brother marry a woman who had read every one of those letters in a single afternoon and loved him more rather than less for what they contained was worth every mile of the 6 years it had taken to get there. Barnaby Fitch was arrested in Missouri 2 months later, and the trial that followed, which Ezra testified at by deposition rather than risk the long journey away from a new bride, secured a conviction that finally closed a case the county sheriff had rushed shut 6 years before out of nothing more than fear and convenience. Delia Whitcomb, as she was known from that Saturday forward, kept all 6 of Mary's letters in a cedar box for the rest of her life, alongside the 7th, the one that had started it all by arriving 3 days too early to spoil a wedding, and exactly in time to save one instead. She told her own children, years later, that she had learned something on that particular Thursday afternoon that she never forgot, that the truest test of loving somebody is not whether you like everything you eventually learn about them, but whether the learning makes you hold on tighter or let go, and that she had known, closing the last letter, exactly which one she intended to do. Mary Whitcomb did not return to Missouri right away. She stayed in Elkhorn through that first winter, officially to see the Fitch matter through its final legal turns by correspondence. Unofficially, because 6 years spent entirely devoted to clearing her brother's name had left her, by her own honest admission, with very little idea what to do with a life that no longer required that particular fight every single day. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that Thaddeus Poole's dry legal correspondence about the ongoing Fitch prosecution made for considerably more interesting reading than a woman planning to remain unmarried had any right to expect. And when Poole rode out from Cheyenne twice more that winter, under increasingly thin professional pretexts, Ezra took considerable pleasure in informing his sister that he recognized courting behavior when he saw it, having recently done a fair amount of clumsy courting himself. Mary married Thaddeus Poole the following autumn, in the same yard under the same cottonwoods, and settled close enough to Elkhorn that the Whitcomb siblings, separated for 6 hard years by a lie neither of them had chosen, were never again separated by more than an easy day's ride. Barnaby Fitch was convicted the following spring on the strength of the clerk's testimony and the ore accounting Mary had spent years assembling, and died in a Missouri prison 11 years later, having never once, by all honest accounts, expressed one word of remorse for the bookkeeper's life his greed had nearly destroyed. Ezra Whitcomb never went back to Barrow's Fork, and never needed to. Whatever life waited for him there had burned down to nothing worth reclaiming 6 years before, and the life he had actually built, one honest chore and one gentled horse at a time, on a ranch in Wyoming, under a name he no longer had any reason to fear, turned out to be worth considerably more than the one a frightened 22-year-old had run from in the dark. If this story moved you, there is another one waiting, complete from first hoofbeat to last, right here on the Cowgirl Chronicles. Come sit with me again soon. Some names are worth waiting for.